So our next discussion on development leads to foreign aid. And foreign aid is a big component of both the development part of it, but also the politics of it. Foreign aid is usually a very contentious foreign policy topic, particularly in election years, where people begin to question the validity of these types of programs. So is foreign aid the answer is, in short, foreign aid is probably not the answer, right? It might have some small role in helping countries overcome underdevelopment problems, but really is the amounts of aid that is given now are so small and unlikely to grow that it's probably not a problem, right? In addition, foreign aid is often misused by recipient governments, so it's not actually used for development purposes. Right. So what is foreign aid? Aid is the form of grants, so this is free money, or loans with very small interest on it that can help countries that need capital for their development programs. This can be bilateral, meaning between one country and another, or it can be arranged by a multilateral organization like the World Bank or the UN Development Program. Excuse me. Right. Again, different types of aid. So there's some aid is focused on economic assistance. Others have security goals. So the United States gives a lot of its aid to both Israel and Egypt to essentially pay them not to fight each other. You might also give humanitarian aid or, again, multilateral contributions. Why give aid? There's a whole list of reasons here. Some of it might be ethical and moral, but others are more of trying to increase economic growth. Again, that's a benefit for all, but it also could be about increasing influence in other countries, right? Think about the United States in the part of the United States national security strategy was development. So it's part of its 3Ds along with diplomacy and defense. Why? It thought that if you can reduce poverty, you might reduce terrorism. You reduce HIV/AIDS, that's sort of a moral victory, and also increase stability in developing countries, particularly in the Middle East. The United States distributes its aid in a lot of different ways, mostly through the USAID component, but also through the Treasury Department or the Defense Department. And a lot of these programs do not coordinate with each other, and so there can be overlapping interests or overlapping monies. The United States is the largest donor in terms of dollar amount, but the smallest donor, or at least one of the smallest donors in terms of percent of the national income. Okay. So again, aid is generally designed to help with global economic health, global health, and democratic stability. And I would say of those three areas, the only one where you see foreign aid actually help is in global health. In economic growth and democracy, it's pretty much a disaster. Okay, so, and because it's been so successful in global health, as we see an increase in global health foreign aid, a lot of that has gone to HIV/AIDS resources, but also towards maternal health and malaria. And again, this is one of the only true success stories of foreign aid. Okay. Other aid programs focus on agricultural, has a big problem, and one of it is actually undercuts the production of agricultural production in other countries. And so let's, for example, focus on food aid. What is food aid? What food aid does is it provides aid to other countries, right? So let's say Ethiopia. So Ethiopia gets a grant from the United States. And with that grant, the Ethiopia is instructed that it must buy food from the United States. So this seems pretty good, right? So the country can get some free money, and then it can use this to buy some food, and it needs this food because there's food shortages in Ethiopia. But then you have to ship all this food across, so it takes some time to get there. All the while, this is just benefiting both American farmers and American transport. And then it gets into Ethiopia finally, and then that food is just dumped into the market by the government. And so, what do you think that does to domestic producers of food? So, farmers. If I'm an Ethiopian farmer, I now have to compete with this free food that's coming from the United States. And that lowers my prices and lowers my income. And so that does not help my developments at all. And since a lot of these developing countries are based on agricultural economic activity, this is a major problem, right? A more successful program would be to take that money and actually pay farmers, Ethiopian farmers, for that money. But the United States doesn't operate that way because the United States aid is a mixture of both trying to accomplish foreign policy goals, but also keeping domestic actors like American farmers happy, right? In terms of democracy-focused aid, the problem with this is while aid is trying to focus on rewarding countries with good institutional performance, it has a bad problem of sort of cheating. So the United States will often sort of give countries aid even though they don't perform well, or even countries that might be performing well, we're not sure because we have a problem of monitoring. So usually geopolitical interference will affect our goals. So generally, there is a giant debate here about whether aid is effective or not. And I asked you to do some reading about this related to Jeffrey Sachs, who's on the left, who is very optimistic about the role of aid. And then William Easterly, no, that's not him on the right. William Easterly is an economist from NYU, and he's pretty pessimistic, right? So the debate goes as follows. Sachs says aid can work, but the amount that's given now isn't good enough. Others, such as Paul Collier, says aid can work, but it needs to be better administered. And then the pessimist is aid doesn't work at all, except for healthcare. So let's just focus on healthcare. And so the optimists, again, can be summarized as aid is the answer, it can lift millions of people out of poverty. This should be coordinated by the UN, sort of a centralized action. And can we think of any examples where this is the case? And the answer to that is no, there actually isn't any examples. Moderates are looking for some middle ground, saying there's too much redundancy, saying sometimes aid works, sometimes it doesn't. Perhaps it can be coupled with military intervention to ensure that aid is used properly, but the data doesn't really support this at all. And then we have the pessimists. Again, this is William Easterly, said aid doesn't work, again, except health programs. Centralized plans coming from people who work in Washington contradicts the tenets of capitalism. Instead, we should be focusing on identifying the entrepreneurs in these societies and giving them money. And so one of the success stories that we see in development comes from these microfinancing, where these small loans are provided to people in villages, and they use these villages to create new industries. But these industries aren't thought about, or some bureaucrat sitting in Washington, D.C. It's actually someone who lives and works in the village who just needs a small short-term loan. And this is where, the pessimists see where development should come from, sort of from the ground up, rather than some centralized program of giving aid, right? And Easterly points to about 60 years of foreign aid failure and all the money that was spent, nothing to show for it. Also says that more and more of this aid actually inflates currency value, which hurts exports. And here's a quote from Easterly, essentially thinking about how we should think about development in terms of planners. And again, these are the bureaucrats who operate in Washington, D.C. versus the searchers. And these are the ones who live in the villages, who know their problems and know what it takes to overcome these problems. And we should give more power to these searchers. Right. So why doesn't it work? Aid creates the wrong incentives. Aid is frequently given for political reasons. We're not very good at targeted aid. Developing states don't have a very good idea of how to deal with these big inflows. They lack responsibility, reduces competitiveness, and often aid comes with strings, and that often hurts competitiveness, right? So again, Easterly thinks we should reduce aid and think more about getting money into the hands of these searchers, and micro-lending or microfinance is one success story that we can point to. But again, that he does give Sachs some credit over this debate in terms of health finance.